It is a personal privilege to introduce Dr. Scott Ellsworth today, and I say that because Scott is my neighbor. We've lived in the area about a decade. I think we've been about a decade in the area. He lives a couple blocks from me. And most of that time, I've known him as the man who walks his corgi. But about a year and a half ago at a neighborhood picnic, in fact, it was during the time of the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, I got to talk to him more and learn about him. And it was there I learned how privileged Scotty's corgi is to be walked regularly by the preeminent expert in this Texas Race Massacre area. So that's what brings him with us today. The Tulsa Race Commission had a race riot commission that was done a few years ago, quite a few years ago now. And I was reading their report last night, and in there, Scott, they had two major consultants, and Scott was one of them, and quoting from the introduction, Ellsworth became the second consultant chosen. He thereafter emerged first in importance. So that shows the significance he has in this area of understanding this situation down there. Not only was he a major contributor to the report, but he's written two books, Death in the Promised Land, which was done some time ago, and the update, which you see on the screen before you hear it today, the groundbreaking An American City in Search for Justice. And that's an update of, not only an update of the situation there, but also dealt with the efforts to how their efforts maybe to control, to not allow the information to get out, and the people that strive to make sure this was lost, and so on and so forth. So I think you'll find it a nice introduction or addition to the first one that came down. Not only has he written about it and chronicled it, but he's been involved in helping to find unmasked or unmarked graves and so on in the area. My wife Marilyn and I were in Tulsa this fall at the Greenwood area, which was the site of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and the people at the museums and theirself, when I mentioned Scott's name, he was well known in that particular area. He joined the UN Department of Afroamerican and African Studies in 2007, and before that he was, Scott by the way has a Ph.D. in history from Duke University. He was a historian with the Smithsonian Institution, and he has been quoted and has appeared on articles in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Today Show, PBS, just a lot of different areas, and now we have him with us today. He's not just the expert in the Tulsa Race Massacre. I'll get it right eventually, Scott, I apologize. He has written some other award-winning books, and one just caught my eye, entitled The World Beneath Their Feet, Mountaineering, Madness, and the Deadly Race to Summit the Himalayas. So maybe we'll have to have Scott back to tell us what that title means for that particular thing. Dr. Ellsworth has two stories to tell. One is the history of the massacre, and that could he could spend the whole rest of the day dealing with that. And the second one is the more personal story of how Scott became an expert and interested in this area. Scott is a native Tulsan, so he knows the area well and how he got started at an early age. And I know we're going to hear a little bit about both of those stories today. Scott, please welcome Scott to the podium.
Well, the fact of the matter is that I always try to avoid Dwayne, but when you're walking a corgi, they have really short legs, so he's able to snag me. He finally got me there. I do want to give you a trigger warning early in this talk and let you know that I will not be mentioning Fort Worth Horned Frogs or TCU in my presentation. But in all seriousness, while I'm not a U of M alumnus, it's really been my honor to teach at your university for the last 17 years or whatever it is. And I can tell you that you don't have to worry about the students there that are there today. They're terrific, they're hardworking, they love the university, and they're very capable of confronting and dealing with difficult subjects and many challenges ahead of them. So I can let you know that as far as the student body is concerned, your university is in good hands. And we have a difficult subject that I'm going to talk about some today. Just to begin, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 was the single worst incident of racial violence in all of American history. In the course of 16 hours, more than 1,000 African American homes and businesses were looted and burned to the ground by white mobs with the help of the Tulsa police and also local National Guard units. Hundreds and hundreds of people received medical attention. To this day, we do not know how many people died. I think reasonable estimates, reasonable ones, go from 100 to 300, but we don't even know what the ratio is in black to white casualties. And we have been searching off and on for 20 years, but intently the last 3 years to see if we can locate the unmarked graves of victims. So this is an ongoing event. So how did this thing all happen? And the place to begin is really Tulsa itself. They call Tulsa the magic city, as in now you don't see it and now you do. In the year 1890, there wasn't even Oklahoma. It was still Indian territory. It didn't become a state until 1907. And Tulsa was something called Tulsi Town. It was a little dusty Muskogee Creek Indian and cowboy town. It looked like the set of a Western movie from the 1940s. Less than 1,000 people lived there, not much going on, no paved streets. 31 years later, by 1921, there were over 100,000 people living in Tulsa. There were 20-story skyscrapers, electric streetcars, movie palaces, electric plants, waterworks, neighborhoods, and all of that. And the reason for that was oil. In 1905, the discovery was made across the Arkansas River from Tulsa of what turned out to be the richest small oil field on earth. And if you can imagine, right in the middle of the United States, a little mini Saudi Arabia was discovered, and that's what it was. And this happens at the time when the world's economy is now going toward an oil-based economy. Winston Churchill, who was Lord of the Royal Navy around this time, he had all future warships in the British Navy go from being coal-fired to oil-fired. And obviously, as we know, living here in southeastern Michigan, this is also the time of the rise of the automobile. As the automobile starts to take over American life and you need gas to run it on. And so here you have this commodity that's absolutely needed and wanted. And what happened in Tulsa is people poured in and money poured in as well. Maybe it was the crack about the horned frogs. I mean, who knows? Anyway, well, let's just carry on until they tell us to leave. And Tulsa was well, there we go. What do you think? Third time's a charm? Okay, let's try it. Okay, so this is a place, this is where J. Paul Getty got its start. This is a place, this incredible booming town, all of this money, all these people pouring into Tulsa to make money. And some of that money went to the African American community in town. Now, blacks in Tulsa have historically made up about 10% of the population. So imagine 100,000 people, 10,000 are African American. And they lived in a district known as Greenwood, and Greenwood became a very storied place in those days. Imagine just 10,000 people, but there were 2 African American theaters that showed both motion pictures, which are relatively new, vaudeville, jazz, all of that kind of stuff. There were more than a dozen churches. There were 2 black newspapers in Tulsa. There was 2 schools, including a brand new brick high school. There was a public library branch. There was an all-black hospital. There were more than a dozen African American surgeons and physicians who lived there. There were more than 35 restaurants, and there were more than 25 grocery stores and meat markets, as well as dress shops and clothing stores and hardware stores and all of that. And you have this this incredible commercial district, later dubbed Black Wall Street, but known as Deep Greenwood. So, and what you have there is you've got maybe a dozen or so black families that are really making it by national standards. The Williams family, for example, owned the Dreamland Theater, which sat 600 people. They also were the first African American family in Tulsa to own an automobile. They also built a garage as more and more black owners African Americans started to buy cars where you could fix cars. They also built a 3-story building, the Williams Building. There was a confectionery on the first floor, sort of an ice cream parlor, candy store. There were apartments where the family lived on the second floor, and on the third floor, they rented out office space to African American attorneys as well. So you've got this community, and it's making it economically, but there's a reason it's making it economically. And it's this, that African Americans were not allowed, they were barred from working in the oil industry. But there was so much money in town and so many millionaires. Tulsa had more millionaires per capita than any other American city for decades. And they wanted African American workers. There was also a high demand, maids and chauffeurs and cooks, child care workers and all that. But there was also a high demand for people working in restaurants, janitors, ditch diggers. So in Greenwood, there was extremely high employment, especially black women as well, too. All right. So these folks, the majority of them, spend their working in the white community. At the end of the week, they get a good paycheck, which would have been in cash, and they bring it home. But rather than shop in the white stores downtown where they would be disrespected, they instead patronize black stores in Greenwood. So that allows this economic engine to grow. Most folks in Greenwood were not rich by any means. They lived in, wooden shanties without electricity and plumbing, but the district itself was a remarkable place. It was very vibrant. There were book clubs, missionary circles, literary societies. This is also the time when this brand new music is conquering the world, and that music is jazz. And there were lots of jazz performers from Tulsa and Oklahoma who later go on to play in the big bands in Kansas City and in Chicago as well, too. So this is a place where the American dream seems to be working for African Americans. And we're only 60 years post-slavery. But while this is going on, while this dream is happening, this is a very dark time for race relations in the United States. The years right around World War I were some of the worst in our history. This is a time of the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. There had been an original Klan right after the Civil War, which was out to make sure that black men didn't vote, used terrorism and whatnot. That Klan dies off. Then in 1915, there's a second Klan. It's not Southern anymore. It's a national organization. The Klan runs the state governments in New Jersey, in Indiana, in Oregon, later in Oklahoma. There were Klansmen in Pasadena, California, in Vermont, in Maine, in Michigan. 20,000 Klansmen and Klanswomen in hoods marched from the White House to the Capitol. This is a huge organization. Not only are they anti-black, they're anti-Catholic, they're anti-Semitic, and they are out to tamp down any notions of equality in the country. This is also the time when lynching is still happening in the United States. While the height of lynching had been really at the end of the 1900s, lynchings are still going on in the years around World War I, and they are getting more and more horrific and brutal. You had lynchings in the United States, in Texas and Indiana, where African American men accused of some trumped up crime are tortured and burned at the stake while thousands of whites come to watch. White families will bring their children and their wives to watch these events. So this is a terrible, very difficult time for African Americans. They're under siege. And so how do black people respond to this? I mean, they do it in different ways. Some turn more to God. Others put their faith in education. But you also have a new group on the stage, which is African American World War I vets. Now, the United States Army was segregated in World War I. You had all black units that fought under white officers in France and in Belgium. And these units were incredibly well known due to their heroism and their courage. In fact, when the French government gave its first croix de guerre to American soldiers, the first ones went to black American soldiers. And what these soldiers found is that they were not faced with racism on a day-to-day basis in France like they experienced in the United States. And so many of them thought, why am I risking my life to make the world safe for democracy, overseas when I'm not getting any at home? So there was a sense of these vets when they came back home. One vet in Chicago, black vet in Chicago, said, if trouble, I'm not looking for trouble, but if it comes my way, I'm not dodging it. And this was also a period of something called race riots in those days. Typically, there's going to be an incident, somehow an interracial incident, that then spreads. In Chicago in 1919, the beaches along Lake Michigan were segregated. And there were some young black boys who built a raft in front of the black beach. They got on the raft. The wind blew it in front of the white beach. Whites started to stone the boys on the raft. That led to fighting on the beaches, which then spread to downtown. African Americans attacked by whites in Duluth. And then white mobs then invaded black neighborhoods or neighborhoods that were starting to desegregate, targeting black homes. They would take all their positions, throw them onto the street, destroy them, and burn the houses. More than 36 people died in Chicago. So these are all part of this wind, these dark winds that are blowing. And in Tulsa, you had one other element. Remember, Tulsa is the city loaded with money. People are going to bed poor, and they're waking up a millionaire the next day because they've hit a gusher nearby. And in a place like that, imagine kind of a Casablanca, Las Vegas, there's going to be a lot of crooks that are there too. There were, hundreds of prostitutes came to Tulsa. There was so much car theft that the New York insurance companies would not sell automobile insurance in Tulsa because cars were getting stolen all the time. And there was a great frustration, particularly amongst middle-class Tulsans, black as well as white, over all of this crime. We've got to do something about it. Then, late in the summer, in August of 1920, there was a crime that changed everything. Now, this event involves no black people at all. Here's what happened. 3 white teenagers in downtown Tulsa hire a taxi cab, two males and 1 female, hire a taxi cab allegedly to take them out to a dance across the river out in the oil fields. So they get in the cab and across the river, and they're out in the country driving towards this oil camp. And one of the teenagers, an 18-year-old former telephone company worker named Roy Belton, pulls out a .38 caliber revolver and sticks it in the side of the cab driver. The cab driver pulls over. He says, "Take my cab, take my money, take anything, just spare my life." Instead, Roy Belton shot him twice in the stomach and then kicked him out on the road to bleed to death and die while the 3 teenagers take off in the stolen cab. All right. But the cab driver doesn't die because just by chance a farmer happens to come along on this rural road, sees him lying there, picks him up, puts him in the truck, takes him to the hospital in Tulsa where the cab driver lingers alive for 3 days. Meanwhile, Tulsa police got a tip. They picked up Roy Belton. The other 2 teenagers were never found again. They arrest him. They bring him to the cab driver's deathbed, and the cab driver identifies him as the shooter. Now, this crime is getting full page, top of the crease, gigantic headlines, the most dastardly shooting in the Southwest. This is the cruelest murder we can imagine. We need to do something about this. There's rumors that Roy Belton is going to get off. He's going to avoid the electric chair by pleading not guilty because of insanity. There's talk that he should be lynched, on. And then finally, 3 days later, the cab driver dies. Belton, meanwhile, has been held in a Tulsa County courthouse in the jail on the top floor of this 4-story building. As soon as word goes out that he's died, a white lynch mob starts to gather outside the courthouse. All of a sudden, and the Tulsa police force is nowhere to be seen. Okay. Meanwhile, the cab where the shooting had occurred in, which had been in the police impoundment lot, was then brought to the scene as well. Finally, a handful of white men with bandanas over their mouths go into the courthouse, tell the sheriff, demand that the sheriff turn over Belton to them. He at first refuses, but they insist. He gives Belton turns over Belton to these gentlemen who put him in the cab, and now the lynch mob now jump into their cars, and they're going to drive across the river to where the shooting happened. The Tulsa police force now suddenly appears, but instead of trying to stop the lynching, they instead help direct traffic so everyone could have a good view. Belton is taken where there's a large tree, a rope is procured, he's then lynched and murdered. Okay. Remarkably, what happens in the next couple of days is that Tulsa's white city fathers all praise this event. The mayor, the chief of police, the other leading figures, they talk about that this was not a criminal act, this was the righteous anger of law-abiding citizens that are going to prove to the unlawful criminal element that we're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior in Tulsa. It's praised the entire time. Nobody's arrested, there's nothing like that. The only dissenting voice was from the Tulsa Star, a black newspaper in Greenwood, which not only condemned the lynching, even though blacks are not involved, but also said that the lynching of Roy Belton explodes the theory that a prisoner is safe in the top floor of the courthouse. Okay. Well, that theory is now going to be tested 10 months later, in May of 1921. So we're now Memorial Day, Monday, May 30th. A young African-American shoe shiner, 19-year-old Dick Rowland, is walking along Main Street in downtown Tulsa. Now, Dick had dropped out of Booker T. Washington High School to shine shoes at a white-owned and white-patronized shoe shine parlor. Okay. In 1978, I interviewed another former African-American shoe shiner who worked with Dick. And he said dropping out, what a horrible thing to do. He said, not at all. He said, in Tulsa at that time, there were so many people who had struck it rich. He said that somebody might tip you $0.25 to shine their shoes, or they might tip you $100, the equivalent of $1,000 today. So it wasn't a bad idea. This is a way to make money. But there were no toilet facilities for the black shoe shiners, so the white owner arranged so his shoe shiners could walk a block down Main Street, ride the elevator to the top floor of the Drexel building where there was a colored restroom they can use. So this was something that Dick Rowland did presumably every day, so he's doing it that Monday as well. In those days, elevators were not automatic. Some of you all are old enough to remember department store elevators where they've got an operator who pulls the cage and turns this wheel, and they always say, watch your step. And the reason they say watch your step is because it's difficult to get the floor of the elevator and the actual floor to line up carefully, all right? So elevator operators in Tulsa in those days were white women, young white women. There was a woman by the name of Sarah Page, who was probably 17 years old at the time, who's the elevator operator there. So here we are on Monday, May 30th, 1921. Dick Rowland leaves the shine parlor, walks to the Drexel building to ride the elevator to the top, but something happens. We don't know what happens. We know that a couple minutes later, there was a scream, Sarah Page screamed, and Dick Rowland ran out the building. Okay. This is what we think happened. I spoke to a woman who used to run the Drexel building elevator in the 70s. She said it was a especially persnickety one. It was very difficult to get the floors to line up. The theory is that as he's walking onto the elevator, Dick Rowland tripped, and then he shot out his hands to break his fall. He played football at Booker T. Washington High School. Probably hit Sarah Page on the shoulder. She screamed out of fright. He became immediately terrified because if anything was a death sentence for a black man in America in those days, it was sexually assaulting a white woman. He then runs out of the building. Now, a white clerk in a men's clothing store on the first floor hears the scream, runs around into the hallway, and sees Dick Rowland leave, running out of the building. He concludes, Rowland tried to attack Sarah Page, okay, this unknown black person. Okay. So the Tulsa police are called. A couple of detectives show up. They don't appear to be particularly worried about this. They don't put out an all-points bulletin. They don't jump in anywhere, to go do something. The next morning, they do go to Dick Rowland's home where he lived with his mother in Greenwood. They arrested him. They took him to the courthouse, put him in that top floor jail cell. Meanwhile, the wheels of justice, even Jim Crow justice, seem to be turning quietly. Sarah Page will refuse to press any charges. Dick Rowland would be eventually exonerated legally. But what happened is that a reporter for the Tulsa Tribune, the city's white daily newspaper, afternoon newspaper, caught wind of it. And then the Tribune, on its front page, ran an inflammatory story saying, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." They said that Dick Rowland wouldn't tell police his name, which his former workmate said was ridiculous, but he called himself Diamond Dick. He had a diamond stick pin that he had been seen stalking Sarah Page, making sure no one was there, that he scratched her face, tore her dress, all that stuff. But that wasn't the end of it, because in the editorial page of the Tribune that afternoon, around now May 31st, there was an editorial titled, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." We had lynched Roy Belton, a white, 8 months earlier. Now we're going to lynch this one. The Tribune hits the streets at about 3:30. By 4 o'clock, there's not just lynch talk on the streets of Tulsa, but a white lynch mob starts to gather in front of the courthouse. 100, 200, 300, 400 people. Meanwhile, word now hits Greenwood that this young African American is in mortal danger. Okay. So a World War I vet jumps up on the stage at the Dreamland Theater and says, "Shut this place down. We ain't going to let this happen here. There ain't going to be a black man lynched in Tulsa." Others are gathering right in the heart of deep Greenwood, the commercial district, trying to figure out what's going on. Now, telephones are relatively new. There's, of course, no radio. There's no television. There's nothing like that. There's a couple phones here and there. People are trying to call in and find out what's happening downtown. But rumors keep growing of the size of this lynch mob. And once again, the Tulsa police are nowhere to be found. They're conveniently absent. So the courthouse is protected simply by the sheriff and his 3 deputies. But there's a new sheriff now. And this sheriff decided he's not going to have a lynching on his watch. So he's disabled the elevator in the courthouse. He's barricaded the stairwell. He's put his 3 men on top with high-powered rifles ready to open fire. And when members of the lynch mob go to the new sheriff and said, "Turn this boy over to us," he refuses to do so. Okay. People are worried in Greenwood, however. So at around 7:30 that night, 25 African-American World War I vets, most of whom have all gone back home to put on their U.S. Army uniforms, all of whom are armed with rifles, pistols, and shotguns, get into cars and they caravan downtown to the courthouse. They get out and march single file to the courthouse steps. They present themselves to the sheriff and say, "We're here to help you protect the prisoner if you need us." The sheriff says, "Get the hell out of here." They get back in their cars and drive back to Greenwood. But their appearance has so enraged the white mob that now members of the white mob go home to get their own guns. They go home to bring others there. A group of about 50 mob members go 5 blocks away to try to break into the National Guard armory to get the high-powered Springfield rifles that are there. A few local guardsmen are able to hold them off. All right. So now Tulsa is crackling like heat lightning with rumors. The lynch mob continues to grow. And again, it's not just men, it's women and children as well, too. 800, 900, 1,000, 1,200. When are we going to do this thing? Why are we waiting? When is this going to happen? Finally, at about 9 o'clock that night, a false rumor hits Greenwood that the whites are now storming the jail. This time, 75 African-American World War I vets, similarly armed, get into cars, once again, caravan in front of the courthouse, present themselves to the sheriff. The sheriff sends them away. As they're leaving, an elderly white man goes up to a tall black vet who had fought in France and says, "Where are you going with that gun, boy?" And he says, "I'm going to use it if I need to." White man says, "Like hell you are, give it to me." A struggle ensues, a shot goes off, and the massacre begins. Now, a lot of stuff happens very quickly. There's a shootout right in front of the courthouse. We don't know how many people died there. Maybe 12, maybe 15, maybe more. But, it's night now. There aren't a lot of street lights. So we think that most of the black vets were able to safely fight a retreating battle back to Greenwood. All right. Whites now could care less about Dick Rowland. They're now out to get any black person that they can find. They are consumed with this racial rage and hatred. We know about innocent black workers getting off of work downtown who were murdered in the streets. A man we think was a janitor ran in an alleyway, went into the back door of a movie theater that was showing a Mary Pickford film. He got up on stage, was blinded by the light, while other whites came in the front of the theater and murdered him with a shotgun on stage as he fell into the orchestra pit. We know about an African American woman who was run down by whites with cars. Now the Tulsa police suddenly show up. Now they magically come up. But instead of trying to disarm the white mob, send them home, instead what they do is they start deputizing members of the white mob and saying, you are now a special deputy, giving them badges and ribbons. But beyond that, white police officers now start breaking into pawn shops and sporting goods stores to gain access to the guns that are for sale there. And we have eyewitness accounts of them telling white men, get a gun and get a black person, although not using those terms. So now the police are arming the mob, suggesting that they go on. There are a few fires that are set between, when this breaks out at 10 o'clock at night until, let's say, 2 in the morning on the edges of the black community, but those are next to white buildings as well, too, so there's concern that if you burn this down, you might burn down a white business. Those are put off. Gangs of whites, meanwhile, make drive-by shootings in black neighborhoods. They'll pile into cars, go roaring down a black residential neighborhood, firing on each side into children's bedrooms and parlors and porches and living rooms. Some African Americans decide already it's time to leave. A significant portion, maybe a third of the population. So they gather their loved ones and head out into the country, navigating by starlight. And there are some murders as well on the edges of the community as well, too. There's also an early attempt to try to invade this deep Greenwood commercial district, which is separated from white downtown and neighborhoods by railroad tracks. And there's an effort by some whites to invade the district, set it on fire. But the streetlights have been shot off, and black property owners are able to defend, get behind windowsills and things like that, and defend the area. They hold that off. So what happens is at about 2 o'clock in the morning, we're now on June 1st, everything calms down. The fighting stops. Everything seems to be calm. And African Americans in Tulsa think it's over. The sun will come up in a few hours. Everything will will become right. They'll sort it out. What they don't know is that whites are now organizing in white Tulsa. So men are going into all-night cafes and speakeasies and bars saying, come to this intersection, come to that intersection. People are telling their neighbors, you have hundreds and hundreds of whites show up at these intersections. A white will get up on a car and he'll say, look, we're going to go in at dawn. Make sure you've got plenty of ammunition. If you need ammunition, let us know. We'll see if we can provide you some. Make sure you have guns. Get ready. So while black Tulsans are starting to relax, meanwhile, in white Tulsa, grandma's putting another pot of coffee on the stove to keep everyone awake because they're going to go in at dawn. All right. So what happens is shortly before dawn on June 1st, we don't know how many, 5,000, 8,000, 10,000 whites have gathered on the across the railroad tracks in the white part of town, away across the tracks from black Tulsa. In 1975, I interviewed a member of the Williams family, the black family that had the first car in the theater and all that. His name was W.D. Williams. He was 16 at the time of the massacre. And he told me during that night before then, he had helped reload his father's .30-30 rifle and repeating shotgun to keep the whites from evading. And he told me that right before dawn, he peered out the family apartment window looking across the tracks, and he said it looked like the Milky Way. And what all those little points of light were were the cigarettes and cigars and pipes of thousands of whites. He says, the sun then comes up. There is a strange siren or whistle, like a factory siren, that went off. We still don't know what it was, but it was the signal for the invasion to begin. And at that point, all these armed white rioters invade Greenwood. All right. So what happens is, and I'm going to be brief because there's a few more things I want to do and I don't want to talk too long, but you really had the systematic destruction of Greenwood. Any African Americans who fought back were overwhelmed and killed by white mob members, sometimes with the help of the police. Others who were there were then, quote, arrested by mob members or law enforcement and taken away to these hastily created internment camps at the baseball park and the fairgrounds and the municipal auditorium, where they're allegedly held for their own protection. Part of that could be true, and kept there under armed guard. But what it also meant is they couldn't defend their property. Black men there was a feeling in the black community that men were especially vulnerable. So there was a family I knew their son, George Monroe. George was a toddler, probably three or 4 years old at the time of the riot. His parents owned a roller skating rink in Greenwood, and they had a home. And as dawn is breaking, they realize the invasion is happening. The mother and father decide the father should get out of there because they're likely to kill him, but the mother would stay with the kids and see if she could protect the home. So she's waiting there with George and his older sisters and brothers. And when the white mobsters come, she tells them, please don't hurt us or our home. We haven't done anything to anyone. We're completely innocent. They tell her to shut up. They haul her away. The kids kind of get scattered. George and his older sister Judy run back into the family home, and they hide underneath his parents' double bed. And George said that as they're hiding there, he could see the feet of the white man, below the bed as they walk in. He said, I could hear them as they opened the drawers of my parents' dresser and were rooting around to try to find money or jewelry. At one point, one of the men stepped on George's finger. He started to cry out, but his sister threw her hand over his mouth. The whites didn't notice he was there, and he said before they left, they set fire to the curtains. And luckily, George and his sister were able to get out. But this happens block by block. You kill anyone who's resisting, you take the others away, and then whites broke into all these stores and homes, looted them, and then set them on fire. African Americans fight back, and they fight back furiously, but they're outnumbered. They're outnumbered 10-1 normally, and even more so on that morning. There were lots of firefights, but they had problems. Not only were they overwhelmed, but the local white National Guard units now start to, quote, fight on the side of the rioters. And they've got machine guns. So they open up a machine gun. They shoot out the rose window of the brand new Mount Zion Baptist Church, one of the finest African American churches in the Great Plains. They shoot people up in the belfry, and then it's set on fire. But African Americans have one other problem too, and that's in the air. And there weren't a lot of airplanes in Tulsa in 1921. We think there were 6 or 7, either owned by millionaires or oil companies. But there's plenty of evidence that planes were flying over Greenwood, that morning. And there's a very solid piece of evidence, and I think open cockpit biplanes, that at least one of the planes, the passenger or co-pilot, lit sticks of dynamite and dropped them on Greenwood, which made Tulsa the first American city ever bombed from the air. So what happens, you have the systematic destruction of Greenwood, and by the time that state troops who've been mobilized by the governor arrive from Oklahoma City and declare martial law, it's too late. Greenwood is gone. All of those houses and grocery stores, all 12 churches have been burned to the ground. The black community is now either hiding in the country or they're held under armed guard in these internment centers, where some of them will be held as long as 3 weeks. All right, let me move ahead quickly. So the Tulsa Race Massacre was front page news all over the country, and in fact, all over the world. Made the front page of the New York Times, made the Times of London, made the Times of India. And Tulsa's white city fathers, the businessmen and politicians and oilmen who ran the town, realized they had a PR problem, because they're trying to bring all of these new people and new money to Tulsa. So what they do is they very proudly declare that white Tulsa is ashamed of what has happened and that we will rebuild the black community. Meanwhile, the news cycle moves on to something else. Earthquake in California, flood in Colorado, fighting, whatever. But instead of trying to rebuild the black community, what the white city fathers did is they tried to steal the land where the Deep Greenwood Commercial District was, because they wanted to build a new train terminal there. African American attorneys were able to finally defeat them in court, but black people went ahead and rebuilt Greenwood on their own. There was great help from the American Red Cross for 8 months or so. This was the first man-made disaster the Red Cross ever came, but they provided lumber and whatnot. And then sort of remarkably, what happens, because there was so much money in Tulsa and that spigot was on, and these black parents had to go back to work. Can you imagine going back to work in the neighborhoods where people have been trying to kill you, where they destroyed your home, your business, because they had to get going again, and Greenwood would eventually rebuild. But something else happened too, and I'm going to end on this and open things up, is that the story of the riot then was intentionally buried, okay? So the official National Guard records and police records were all destroyed, never to be found again. That front page article in the Tulsa Tribune, inflammatory article, that was cut out of bound volumes of the Tribune before they were microfilmed by the WPA in the 1930s. That infamous editorial was also torn out, never to be found again. Tulsa's police chief, in the week after the riot, ordered his white officers to go to all of the white photography studios in town and to seize any photographs of the massacre or of dead African Americans and the negatives. We know that a box of photographs that we'd never seen before was in police department hands until the 1970s and then has disappeared, never to be seen again. And what happened is that when people started to research this, they had their livelihoods threatened, they had their lives threatened, and this thing was absolutely buried for decade after decade. In fact, both Tulsa newspapers, white newspapers, for 50 years would never once mention the massacre at any point, even though they had columns on the history of the city and all of that. So there's more I can talk to, but I want to open up things to questions. Eventually, we were able to get this story out. I tell that story, in this book. I play a role in that. I wrote the first, comprehensive history of the massacre when I was in my 20s in graduate school, a book called Death in a Promised Land. It was published in 1982, and it's been in print since then. And for years, it was the most stolen book out of the Tulsa City County library system. They take all, and so once a year, they take all the branch copies. I would just send them a box of books and get them back in there. The story is more well known today, obviously. We've had a lot of attention. There's been an ongoing fight to win reparations for riot survivors and their descendants. And we've also been searching to try to find the mass graves of massacre victims. Remember, when the riot ends, martial law is declared, all the black people are held under armed guards, and you have all of these dead, and they are hastily buried in unmarked graves. So we've used oral history and other funeral home records that nobody's seen in 75 years. We've identified some locations where we think there are mass graves. Our hope is to find these people, to see if we can use DNA to identify them. But, they were thrown away, 101 years ago. It's time to bring them home, to bury them with honor, and to memorialize them. And lastly, I'll just say this. The massacre is a shadow over my hometown to this day. National Geographic magazine, the summer before last, did a study on how much generational wealth was lost in Greenwood because of the massacre. And Greenwood, to this day, there's only about 30,000 African Americans there. But they determined that if the massacre had not happened, there would be an additional $630 million of generational wealth in Black Tulsa today. I mean, that is decades of college tuition, house down payments, seed money for new businesses, child care, elder care, you name it. As William Faulkner once said, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. Thank you very much. Okay, so fire away. And I can hear you. And I can repeat. You want me to repeat the question, or do you want to do it on that? Okay, well, she's got her hand up, so come to her. Please.
I should have known.
Have you suffered any personal threats for the work you're doing?
No, well, let me tell you, so I started this work the summer before my senior year in college, and it was going to be for my senior thesis. And but 4 years earlier, a local white Republican businessman, very conservative, a Vietnam vet, who also had a kind of a local history radio show. He decided he was going to write an article for the 75th anniversary of the massacre. And he interviewed all of these people. And he was targeted. He was approached by people he never knew on the street, said, "Don't you dare write that article, don't do it." People would call his home phone at all hours during the night, threatening to kill him, his wife, their infant son. He said he wasn't worried about himself, but he was worried about his wife and child, who went to the mother-in-law's place. He said one morning he woke up and there was a dead chicken on his doorstep. Another morning he went out to the car and there was a note on the windshield saying, "Best check under the hood the next time," meaning we're going to bomb your car. He persevered. He wrote his article. He brought it to the two white daily newspapers. They told him it was the best thing they'd ever read, and they refused to print it. So when I come along, it's 1975. Let's get kind of the era. I'm kind of this skinny, long-haired guy in a thrift store cowboy shirt. Nobody was really worried about me. I wasn't threatening at all. And I think I kind of slipped under the radar, frankly. But it's really because some of these elderly African-American massacre survivors who had been waiting all their lives to tell this story, but they were waiting for a college professor or a journalist or, NBC News or something. They sure as hell weren't waiting for me, but they opened up to me. And it's because they did, we were able to save a lot of these dynamics.
Occasionally you refer to this as the riots and other
Hi, Andy.
times. You've referred to this both as the riots and the massacre, and I assume the riots is sort of a white-ish way of looking at it, and massacres a more...
No, it's not. That's the funny thing. So when it happened, everybody called it the race riot. The Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Defender, famous African-American newspaper, the race riots in Tulsa, and that's what everybody called them in those days. Everybody knew in the 1920s that a race riot meant that white people are invading black neighborhoods with intent to pillage and violence. Okay. But then the term race riot gets applied later on to other things, like what we used to call the Detroit race riot or Watts race riot is now known as the Watts Rebellion or the Detroit Rebellion. And so riot became a term that some people were very uncomfortable with, particularly African Americans, because they thought it meant, the Rodney King riots, that blacks and whites were kind of equally culpable. And then there was this whole mythology that was created that said that, and this is true, so the well-to-do blacks had insurance on their buildings and all that stuff, but the insurance companies refused to pay for it, saying that, this was a civil insurrection, you're not getting all that. And so it was put out that white people called it a riot to keep black people from having insurance payments, which was not true. So the term massacre finally kind of broke through in the last couple of years. The reality is there's not a good term for this. I once called it an American Kristallnacht, which is not bad. It's been called a pogrom, which is not a very common word in the United States. I can live with massacre. I'm kind of going with the flow. But the old timers, all these survivors, they always called it the riot, no question. He's coming.
I'm curious about what happened to you after this was first published. You worked for the National Archives? Does that mean
I worked for the Smithsonian. So briefly, I'll tell you sort of my story as briefly as I can. First of all, I went to Reed College, this little tiny college in Portland, Oregon, where I made my big mistake in life. I mean, we had less than 1,000 students. Everybody knew everybody. And one of my classmates was this guy named Steve, who was really interested in computers. And I didn't drop out with Steve Jobs like a couple of my classmates did, live in his garage and are zillionaires now and stuff like that. So anyway, I became a history major. I went to Duke. And then while I was in graduate school, I moved to Washington, D.C. I published Death in a Promised Land, the first book, while I was still a graduate student. And I taught for a year at Howard on a fellowship, but then I went to the Smithsonian for 10 years, worked there, and I decided I didn't want to be a college professor, and which I avoided until recently. And I started writing for the New York Times, Washington Post, the LA Times, did film work, did different stuff, get married along the way, decades passed. And finally in 2015, well, a few things happened. First, we moved here, whatever it was, 2005 or whatnot. My wife and I had twin boys, and we decided that rather than have both parents work, where one parent is essentially working to pay for childcare, that we'd go back to the 1950s model that I was a part of, have one parent stay at home for those first 5 years. She's a former jock. She's had 3 knee replacements, 30, knee operations. She wasn't going to be able to do it. So for 4.5 years, I was a full-time stay-at-home dad to twin boys. I probably did 10,000 diapers. I know how to make formula. I know all the Barney songs, all that stuff. But meanwhile, I was also trying to write this new book about race and basketball during World War II. And we moved to Ann Arbor. And I'd always been super healthy. I missed 1 day of public school from kindergarten to 12th grade. I had the 3-day measles on a weekend, so I missed 1 day. And I'd been an athlete and all that. But we got here and I started to drag. And when we moved to town, someone had recommended, I hope I don't offend anybody, but kind of a crunchy granola, touchy-feely hippie doctor as our GP, who, if you had a problem, he would recommend chamomile tea. We finally decided to get rid of him. So I'm feeling not very good. We get a great new doctor. He takes a blood test. Turns out I have prostate cancer to beat the band. So anyway, I had no connection to U of M, none whatsoever, but due to our insurance, U of M surgeons saved my life, and I'm cancer-free. It's all good. And thank you. Well, thank U of M. I mean, let me tell you. So we're trying to think what we could do to thank them, and we didn't have any money. And I thought, well, I could teach a class, and people had knew about my Tulsa work, so I started part-time at DAS, and I've been quickly full-time. I've been there ever since. But what I also do is I write books. So I've published 3 books in the last 7 years. I'm hopefully about to start another one. So, we're an undergraduate department, but there's a little twist here. So despite the fact that I've had a book in print forever, done other stuff, because I had not gone to all the historical conventions and done the traditional things, they wouldn't allow me to apply for tenure. So they turned me into a lecturer, which made me mad at first because I said, I probably shouldn't say this. I hope nobody hears it. But which meant they paid me less, but I don't have to serve on committees. So I have time to do my books. So anyway, so that's what I'm doing. So my second book was called The Secret Game, which was in 1944 during the height of segregation. There was essentially an illegal, clandestine, integrated college basketball game. Very dangerous happened. It was kept hidden. I learned about it. It's a book about that, but it's a book about how in the generation before the Civil Rights Movement, there were white people and black people in the South who were fighting against segregation and taking great chances. It's a story of them. The next book was about the race between German, British, and American mountain climbers, the 1930s particularly, but up to the 1950s, to be the first to summit one of the great peaks of the Himalayas. And then this last book I hadn't planned on writing, but my agent suggested it, and I realized that because I've been doing this forever, is that I was one of the few people still alive that knew how this thing had been covered up and also knew how we got it uncovered. And I thought that's an important story because while there's nothing the size of Tulsa across America, there's lots of little Tulsas and things like that in every community. And I wanted to tell people on how you confront those and try to deal with them. Did that help? All right, good. We got more, okay?
This is actually kind of a two-part question.
Sure.
You described how the event started, and it seems like that's an event that could have happened in a lot of cities in the United States and triggered this whole thing. I wonder if there's something that would say why was Tulsa different, and it actually got so large so fast. And the second part is the folks that are there now. So I've read a lot about the Holocaust, like a lot of people have,
Sure.
and they talk about how the youth of Germany really recognizes their history, but also feels like they've learned from it and tried to move on from that. So is there any movement in Tulsa that makes them move on from what their history was?
Well, I think it's not moving on, it's moving in to confront it. The great irony about Tulsa is, so in the white community, this was not talked about, okay? And I mentioned how people were threatened and all that, it was entirely whitewashed. I had elementary school classmates whose family moved to Tulsa from rural Kansas in the 1950s. The mother told me that, they move into this nice middle-class neighborhood and they're at a welcome party of neighbors. And the Kansans had heard about the race riot and they mentioned it. She said the room went stone cold and people said, we don't talk about that here. The irony is, though, a couple things. One is that, and in fact, this was so effective that by the late 1940s, there was a wonderful woman named Nancy Feldman who grew up on the North Shore of Chicago, well-to-do Jewish family, chauffeur, all that kind of stuff. And she ended up falling in love in World War II with a Jewish GI from Tulsa. They get married. They moved to Tulsa. She had a law degree from Chicago. She first tries to find work as a female lawyer in Tulsa. That didn't happen. She said every law firm she went to, they asked her first how many words per minute she could type. And the second thing is that one of the senior partners would ask her out on a date. So she finally bagged that. She became a sociology professor at the University of Tulsa, which was a small regional university, all white, all local kids. And in the late 40s, Nancy heard about the Tulsa Race Riot. She met a survivor and through recreation and other things. And she was blown away by it. She asked her in-laws, because she'd never heard about it, and they told her it was true. And so at class the next day, she tells these all white 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old Tulsa kids about the race riot, and they say, you're nuts. Nothing like that ever happened here. And she said, of course it did. She said, ask your parents. And so they go home and they come back and they say, our parents told us nothing like that happened here, even though they knew it had. And so Nancy was determined, and so she ended up bringing this African American massacre survivor to her class and had him speak, which was very dicey in race relations, Oklahoma in the 40s. But that wasn't the end of it, because her dean called her in the next day and said, if you do that again, I'll fire you. All right. So there was that. But what was interesting is that in the African American community, this was such a traumatic event that many survivors wouldn't talk to their children or grandchildren about it either. They, like World War II vets who didn't want to relive all of that, and like a lot of Holocaust survivors as well too. So there was a wonderful woman who was my age, Brenda Alford, African American. Her grandparents lost their home and business in the massacre. She didn't hear about the massacre until the 1990s because people wouldn't talk about it. So you've had to kind of break through all of that. The massacre is well known in Tulsa today. Now, there are some white Tulsans who want to keep it buried, but they've lost that fight. There are others that are ashamed. There's others that are angered. Look, Oklahoma is the reddest of the red states. Not a single county voted for Obama. It's the only state where not a single county voted for Obama in either of his elections. Trump won every single county in Oklahoma, both of his. In the last election, he won Oklahoma by 35 points. So this is a very conservative place. However, we have a Republican mayor who is funding us to restart the investigation into the mass graves. So it's something that we're coping with. Unfortunately, Oklahoma is one of those states that's passed these laws that, oh, you can't teach anything that'll make an ethnic group feel bad about themselves, claiming all this critical race theory nonsense. And, and so they're struggling with it. The city's struggling with it. But there's been, I'll tell you this, in the 1970s when I was a college student, I'd go to city employees trying to find some record or something, and they'd blow me off. Oh, we ain't got nothing like that, or I'll have to check with my supervisor, whatever. By the 1990s, you would have a little more cautious help. I'll see what I can find. In the last 3 years, the city employees have bent over backwards to help us in any way that they can. So there's been a change, but we got a ways to go.
I just want to say thank you so much. I will never forget this day and listening to you tell that story with such power, because you have dedicated yourself to really find, not single-handedly of course, but to really finding out about this, because this is such a horrific story, but it is part of our country's history and it must be known. So I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you, and my publisher would like to also point to the screens on either side. You don't have to read the book, you just have to buy it.
I second her motion there. Do you ever wonder what our world or our country would be like today if we had not hidden that in the past? And all these years, we would have had more improved race relations.
Well, sure. I mean, I think, and I'll very quickly on this. So we only have one history, okay? The history is what it is, all right? But the reality is that African Americans, quote, remember our history different than white Americans do, because they've had such vastly different experiences. And the way that we think about our history informs how we think about today and what we're going to do tomorrow. What we have to do is we have to get on the same page, understanding what our past was. Look, there are a million things we have to be proud of as America. America, for as young as a country it is, has given great gifts to the world, lasting gifts, and stuff we can be proud of. But there's a lot of other stuff that we should not be proud of. But we have to have, if we're going to respect our history, we have to have enough courage to look at it all, regardless of where it lands.
Well,
Thank you.
I'm glad you're Dwayne's neighbor. But thank you. This was.
I'm going to walk the dog another way.
This was very interesting, and I would say it's also a part of history that most of us are hearing about for the first time in this kind of detail. So we really appreciate your presentation. The program is over for today, but please put February 9th on your calendar for the next program. The Learn and Grow that day is called Documenting Your Family History, Organizing for the Next Generation. So for all of you that have pictures and letters and such, the focus is going to be organizing and how to maintain it so it doesn't like mold in your basement. The seminar is going to be Dr. Ketra Armstrong from Kinesiology, Inside the Game, Race, Gender, and the Socio-Cultural Business of Sport. So again, the seminar next month is going to be very interesting. And thank you for coming. Have a good month, and we'll see you next month.